Welcome to a special session on Awarelogue, an initiative for awareness and dialogue. His Royal Highness, the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, died on the 9th of April 2021 at the age of 99. To reflect upon the life and legacy of the Prince, I have with me today a Doctor of Medicine who has served in many Commonwealth Institutions, think tanks, for more than 30 years. He was Deputy Chair and Trustee of the Royal Commonwealth Society in London. He also served on the Advisory Council of the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Trust and the Ramphal Institute for Commonwealth Policy Studies. He served as Sri Lanka's High Commissioner in the United Kingdom, where he was elected Diplomat of the Year, the first and only occasion on which a Sri Lankan received this award. He chaired the Board of Governors of the Commonwealth Secretariat and played a pivotal role in facilitating CHOGM 2013 and the visit of their Royal Highnesses, the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall. He is currently the chair of the Advisory Council for Sri Lanka of the British Asian Trust, a charity of His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales. I have with me today Dr. Chris Nonis. Welcome to Awarelogue, Dr. Chris Nonis. Thank you for your time to reflect on the Duke of Edinburgh. Let's go back to the very beginning, to his birth. He was not originally British. What was his childhood, his background?
Well, Prince Philip was born in 1921 in Corfu as Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark by virtue of his patrilineal descent from King George I of Greece and King Christian IX of Denmark. But, of course, the family was exiled when Prince Philip was just 1.5 years old.
And he was related to the Queen even before marriage?
Absolutely. He was related both on his maternal and paternal side. His mother, as you know, was Princess Alice of Battenberg, subsequently Mount Batten, and she was a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria. So he was, on the one hand, related to the Queen as a third cousin via Queen Victoria, and on the other hand, was related via King Christian of Denmark as a second cousin once removed. So, therefore, yes, he was related, both on his mother's and father's side.
He was also sent to boarding schools in the United Kingdom. You had a similar experience. You were at St. Paul's. Of course, that dates back to 1509, whereas Gordonstoun, where he went to, that was 1934. What impact did this have on his formative years?
Well, I think boarding school does have a tremendous impact. I mean, what it does is I think it encourages a sort of discipline, self-reliance, self-initiative. It makes one very independent, and because one doesn't have one's parents all the time to shield one from all the difficulties and the emotions and the traumas of growing up. But it does make people independent and make people also, because one has to live with a community of others, it makes one also more empathetic and sympathetic to their difficulties and needs which otherwise one may not be aware of. So I think it prepares one for life in general.
Yes. Going back to 1947, that was when he was engaged and married to the then Princess Elizabeth. This would have been a pretty big highlight of that year, of that decade, perhaps of the century for the royal family in terms of the royal wedding that was taking place after the Second World War. How do you look at that relationship, that romance that started in 1947, or well, much before that, but continued until date?
Well, I think it's a wonderful lifelong romance, but of course, if you look at how it began, as you know, Prince Philip spent his early childhood in different countries, France and Germany, and eventually in England, and then settled and was predominantly looked after by his maternal relatives, the Mountbattens, and then at Gordonstoun. But then he was encouraged by Louis Mountbatten to join the Royal Navy, and then I think at the age of 18, he joined the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth. And during that time, of course, he had a very active service during the World War. I mean, he was in several different places. He also was in the Pacific Fleet, and he also was in the Indian Ocean at one time. And during that time, I must add that whilst he was in the Indian Ocean in duty, he was based for a while in Colombo on HMS Ramillies and was involved both in Colombo and Trincomalee during that time. But I understand, he had already met the then princess during childhood at the Duke of Kent's wedding. But subsequently, when the King George VI and the Queen, together with Lord Mountbatten, visited the Royal Naval College, he was assigned the task of looking after the two princesses. And I understand it was love at first sight. And then, of course, the Princess Elizabeth was only 13 and he was 18. But I understand that they corresponded throughout the war years. And after the war ended, he actually asked His Royal Highness for her hand in marriage. And they were engaged in 1947 and were married later. They got married later that year. But of course, he did renounce, prior to his marriage, he renounced his royal titles of Greece and Denmark and the royal styles. He also took on his maternal name, Mountbatten, and became a naturalized British subject. But on his wedding day, King George VI appointed him as Duke of Edinburgh and gave him the style His Royal Highness. And I think he became a prince several years later in the 1950s. So yes, I mean, in terms of the wedding, I think that this was something that had obviously happened for a long, long time. And it's an enormous tribute to both the Queen and Prince Philip that it lasted for so long. He was the longest serving royal consort in British history, serving the longest reigning monarch in British history. And I think that's tremendous. 7 decades of it. And of course, they then went to Malta for a couple of years after their marriage, and he was serving out there. And King George VI was then fairly infirm, and therefore the young couple undertook a Commonwealth tour. And it was whilst they were out in Kenya, I think at Treetops, that they heard that sadly King George VI had passed away. And it was then, I think, that it dawned on, there was a gradual realization to Prince Philip, that he would then have to abandon his beloved naval career and instead look to performing his duty as royal consort, which he did tremendously well for the next 7 decades. In fact, at the coronation in 1953, he took an oath of allegiance and for service and duty to the Queen for the rest of his time. And I think he did so very well.
And he also went on to be the longest lived male member of the royal family.
Absolutely.
And his years of service, as you mentioned, whether it was from the coronation onwards, we saw him only taking retirement just a few years ago. Until then, he continued service to the country, to the Queen. But when we look at his legacy, when we talk about what he contributed throughout this period, how would you reflect upon him as an individual who not only supported the Queen, but also had a very unique role to play? This was something very different at that time, from the 50s onwards. No doubt it was a very unique position that he had. He was always one step behind the Queen. The Queen was the main focus, but Prince Philip also remained very much a part and parcel of the royal family, as a very senior royal. How would you reflect on that?
Yes, absolutely. I think that he absolutely understood the role of a royal consort. And he never, at any time, overshadowed Her Majesty. But yet he was always there to support her. I mean, during the short while, say, the 30 years in which I've had several interactions in several different capacities within the several different Commonwealth institutions. I've always been pretty impressed by how wonderfully they partner together at every event, at everything they do. And I must say, in addition to that, he also carved out a very strong role for himself. You have to remember he was the patron of over 900 organizations. He was a passionate environmentalist. He was a great advocate for conservation. I think he was the president of the World Wildlife Fund from the 1960s, 1961. And when he was talking about the imperative of saving the environment, I think many people around him really didn't understand in any way what he was talking about, but he was years ahead of them. He, I think, was patron of the British Heart Foundation for over 50 years. And he was also very, very interested in technology. Very interested. He did a lot for promoting British business abroad, and did a lot to try and upgrade things and to promote new technologies. There's also, of course, his background is, of course, he was a great sportsman, and he was a great polo player. I think in the 1960s, probably one of the best polo players, and certainly in the top 4 or 5 in England. And he took up. He was also a great sailor, of course, with his naval background. But he was also tremendously, of course, probably the greatest thing that people remember that he did was, of course, starting the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme together with Kurt Hahn, who was the founder of Goldenstone. And when you look at it today, I mean, over 6.5–7 million youngsters throughout the world have been able to discover their talents, to unleash their hidden talents, to develop a self-confidence and leadership skills through the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme. And he's also been a patron of so many Commonwealth institutions. And I think he's been a great sport to Her Majesty in all her duties.
And he did this right up until his retirement.
Absolutely.
Just a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, how many... At his retirement at the age of 96. I don't know how many people around the world would actually carry on working till 96 and then actually retire at the age of 96. I think it's absolutely phenomenal and something that people have taken for granted.
You've already had 4 careers under your belt. You've been a doctor in the NHS. You've been heavily involved with the Commonwealth Institutions and think tanks. You've also led a 180-year-old conglomerate and been Sri Lanka's High Commission to the Court of St. James. When you look at the fact that people do have the capacity to go on, do you think humour played a big role in his life? Was that something that really propelled him forward, and have you experienced it?
Well, many people said so. I mean, every time I've interacted, well, almost every time I've interacted with him, there's been one joke or another. I mean, he's got tremendous humour. And he's extremely witty. Well, let me think of, if one looks at from his naval side, I remember I was once, many, many years ago, maybe 25 years ago, we were down along the line, and he came up to me, as one does, and he said, I was quite young then, I think, medical student, junior doctor. He said, "Are you a naval man?" So I was kind of taken aback, and I said, "No, Your Highness, I'm a doctor of medicine. Why do you ask?" And he said, "Because you're wearing a naval tie." And then I looked down at my tie, and I suddenly realized, of course, I belong to the Naval Club in Mayfair, and obviously I put on whichever tie matched my suit at the time so that I would be well in time for the event. And what's impressive is that he was standing a fair distance away from it, and even with my glasses, I don't think I would have noticed the crest on the naval tie. But it was quite funny, and it broke the ice. And I remember another time. I mean, as a doctor, as you know, as I said, he was the patron of the British Heart Foundation, and he was very interested in healthcare and so on. And we were having a little chat about my work in the National Health Service, and about the challenges of the NHS and how it's such a wonderful institution. I was telling him how wonderful an institution it was. And so we were all in line, and rather than moving forward as the retinue does, having spoken about the NHS, he then suddenly turned round and walked in the opposite direction, and which they don't normally sort of retrace. One doesn't normally retrace one's steps. And he went and spoke to someone a few places down whom he'd already spoken to, a lady. And he brought her up towards me and said, "Well, young doctor, this lady is very senior in the College of Nursing. And now that I've put a nurse and doctor together, who knows what might happen?" So we were all a little bit shocked, but then laughter, because it was just so funny, because at a lot of these events, whether Commonwealth or other official events or institutional events, people are all a bit daunted and all a bit worried. And he has this amazing knack of putting people at ease, and extremely, extremely sharp-witted. You know, it's always been like that. And I remember many, many, many years later when I took up the post of High Commissioner, and we were at a palace event and chattering away, and he came up to us and said, "You all look rather smart. I mean, all of you High Commissioners, what do I call a group of very smart chattering High Commissioners? Do I call them a gaggle of High Commissioners?" But I think the funniest one, though, the one is the most memorable one, is when some of my colleagues, this happened several years ago, some of my colleagues were with their wives, and so the Duke came along to us, and I was with I was accompanied by one of my older sisters. So he came up to me and said, "Well, is this lovely lady your dear wife?" And I said, "No, Your Highness, it's my elder sister." He said, "Really? How many sisters do you have?" So I said, "I've got 3, Your Highness, 2 elder and 1 much younger. I've got 3. And he said, "Lucky you, I've got 4. You know, and you could see my sister's face. But it was very funny because it was very witty, and it was not intended in any negative way. It was just extremely witty at the time. And in this way, he manages to actually sort of relax the crowd and relax the people. And wherever he goes, there's lots of laughter behind it. So I do remember, I mean, I can relate to a lot of other things, but then those are probably the most memorable.
Certainly humour did play a big role in his life and the service that he rendered. And talking of the service, and he was very involved with the Commonwealth, whether he was with starting the Commonwealth study conferences or accompanying Her Majesty the Queen for so many chogams around the world, as well as those in the United Kingdom. We now see Prince Charles playing a very, very prominent role in the Commonwealth. He was in Colombo for the 2013 sessions as well. Going into the future, what do you see the role of the royal family being within the Commonwealth?
Well, firstly, I think that Her Majesty the Queen has been the glue, the Commonwealth glue that has held all these diverse cultures and countries together in the Commonwealth as an institution. And I think she has seen it evolve tremendously over the years to what it is today. But I also have had the privilege of interacting with His Royal Highness Prince Charles on numerous occasions, and played a little part in assisting and facilitating the trouble for Sri Lanka during my time as High Commissioner, and also facilitating the visit of His Highness Prince Charles and Duchess Camilla, and also being a little bit involved with one of his charities, the British Asian Trust. What I have realized, Prince Charles has a very deep and nuanced understanding of the Commonwealth. He's visited over 40 countries of the 50 or so Commonwealth countries. He's taken part in so many things. He was involved very much in the Commonwealth Development Corporation many years ago. He's represented Her Majesty at the Jubilee in Sri Lanka in 2013. And I think he has a very, very empathetic view of very diverse cultures that make up this rich tapestry of the Commonwealth. And certainly even interacting, for example, even with his views and what he does and the initiatives he does with even the British Asian Trust. You know, he has a really deep interest and understanding of Commonwealth countries. And I think that I have no doubt that he followed in an exemplary manner Her Majesty, in Her Majesty's footsteps as the future head of the Commonwealth.
What would you say was the legacy of Prince Philip?
Well, Prince Philip, I think we've said so much that he was the longest serving royal consort in British history. And I think that he was, to me, the quintessential gentleman, because he gave up his beloved naval career. He had a challenging childhood. He gave up his beloved naval career and focused himself and committed himself in every manner to his duty, which was to serve and support his wife, the Queen, and the monarchy, and the country, and the Commonwealth during this second Elizabethan era. And I think that was his legacy.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Nonis, for taking time to reflect on the life and legacy of His Royal Highness, the Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. And with that, we end this session, where we focused on a very long, distinguished, and amazing contribution that was made by a single individual in a country which had an impact beyond the shores of that country. That's what we've seen through the life and times of Prince Philip. With that, we end this session on Awarelogue. Thank you for joining us. And as Dr. Nonis just mentioned, what we saw was his contribution to Queen, country, and Commonwealth in this, the second Elizabethan era. Thank you very much.